Sermon today is how many times do you think I could throw this deck of cards up in the air and they fall down and form a house of cards? Do you think it would take a day, a week, a month, a year, maybe never? Well, let's see. Let's try it once and see if it happens. No house of cards, not even one standing. And so basically in our discussion of cosmology last week, we asked the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And consider what is the most reasonable explanation that there is something, particularly with regard to the specific cosmological parameters that are necessary for life to even have a fighting chance. We found that there were pretty compelling evidences that a designer, a being like God, had to be involved in the process. In fact, when I was talking to Dennis Dern about this on Wednesday, he mentioned a comment that Carl Sagan had, a famous cosmologist and atheist. As the Hubble telescope was reaching the ends of its journey, he actually suggested to them that rather than taking pictures out, that they take a picture back towards the sun, back towards the solar system. And basically what Carl Sagan was struck by, in the vastness of the universe, the vastness of space, this little blue speck that was the Earth. And how significant and different that is compared to everything else in all of creation. And so basically that was the conversation last week. But this week, as we turn our attention to biology, the primary question we ask changes a little bit as we ponder whether living things can come from non-living things. Whether living things can come from non-living things. For certainly, if our existence and the existence of other living things is going to be explained by natural causes independent of God, then living things would have to be generated from non-living things. Even though we saw last week that the very existence of the non-living requires explanation in and of itself. And one thing I would ask you to consider is that in our experience, in terms of just what we have in our lives, we never see living things coming out of non-living things. We never have carbon-based molecules in terms of those things developing out of non-living things. And so all the things that could, even in its most basic level of defining life, we never have that coming out of non-living things. So you think about the impossibility of what would need to happen for living things to come out of non-living things. It's even far more expansive than just building a house of cards out of a deck of cards thrown up in the air. And we will see that what is required to go from non-living to the living is like throwing up the cards, but goes beyond that. Now, naturally, when I say that naturalists or evolutionists believe that life came from non-living matter, that is not to say that they think that there was all this non-living matter hanging around and then out popped a cat or an orangutan or a lizard. No, rather, working backwards from the complexity that we see today, there would be a gradual progression back to the most simple forms of living matter coming from the prebiotic soup. Charles Darwin, the father of evolutionary theory, said himself that he imagined that life started in some warm little pond on the Earth's surface. But what Darwin did not appreciate is the utter complexity of even the most basic aspects of living matter. For instance, proteins are the most basic building blocks of all living things that are not living cells themselves, but they make up a large part of living cells and determine, control, enhance many operations within the cell. Well, the complexity of a protein molecule itself is staggering. They are made up of chains of amino acids that not only have to be the right kind of amino acids, basically L-type amino acids as opposed to D-type amino acids. The amino acids have to be joined by the right kind of bonds, particularly peptide bonds, and the amino acids have to be placed in the right sequence. To appreciate the detail needed in the sequencing of amino acids, the disease sickle cell anemia is caused by only one incorrect active site along the chain of amino acids links that make up the hemoglobin molecule. Sickle cell anemia, this is a condition where certain people just have this development in their bodies where, again, this problem is happening in just one spot on an amino acid chain. And what happens is, rather than the hemoglobin red blood cell being round, it is sickle-celled. And therefore, it cannot exist as long, live as long, and it can't carry as much oxygen as a regular blood cell is. So basically, sickle cell anemia is anemia. It's a lack of oxygen, it's a lack of blood that is actually happening because of the way the hemoglobin molecule develops. But that's just one site on an amino acid chain. And so therefore, that just indicates how specific things need to be for things to be right. See, the question isn't why does that happen. The question is, why does that not happen more often? Why is it that the majority of people don't have that problem? That whatever specificity and complexity that needs to happen just to develop an amino acid chain that develops the protein to make a hemoglobin molecule work the way it would just is incredible. See, the production of a protein molecule in terms of probability is the probability of an L amino acid as opposed to a D amino acid is 0.5 or 50%. The probability of a peptide bond is 0.5 or 50%. The probability of getting a right amino acid in a particular position is 5% or 0.05. Now, I know all of you have had statistics classes, right? Yeah, that's a presumption. But basically the way statistics and probability works is if you need various events to happen together at the same time, you multiply the probability of each action, and then you have the probability of all three things coming together. So if you take 0.5 for the type of amino acid, 0.5 for the bond that is there, and then 0.05 for the right place, you have 0.0125 out of 100 that an amino acid would be in a particular place. Alright? Now, if you have a functional protein that had 100 active sites, the probability of getting a proper assembly of those amino acids would be 0.0125 times itself 100 times. And so basically, when we're talking about a protein molecule, see, an amino acid is just a part of a protein molecule. And it takes 0.0125 just for that to be in the right place. Now you have a protein that has 100 amino acids that need to be in the right place. That is 0.0125 times itself 100 times. So the likelihood of that is 4.9 times 10 to the negative 191 power. So what that is 0.19049. Now, do you know how small that number is? Like you say, boy, there's a 5 in 100 chance of this happening. There's like that's 20%. We're having a number that's 0.19049 of getting a protein right. Again, far beyond even throwing up a deck of cards and getting a house of cards. As one author writes, such improbabilities have led essentially all scientists who work in the field to reject random accidental assembly or fortuitous good luck as an explanation for how life begins. One scientist stated the current scenario of the origin of life is about as likely as the assembling of a 747 by a tornado whirling through a junkyard. And that is not even taking into account that in a prebiotic soup, while analyzing the conditions under which amino acids would have to have been made and formed, and proteins forming from them, what to say that they wouldn't react with other non-amino acid chemical species, or be destroyed by long wavelengths of light, or by heat, or by continued electrical discharge. In other words, we're talking about even a perfect environment of that .190 zeros 49. See, that would be like throwing up the deck of cards, and one of the cards stands up by chance. For those who are in the back, it stands up. In terms of working on the probability, and really it's not the way probability works, you would have to keep that card standing. See, in other words, once an amino acid may be formed out of the non-living, you have to keep that in place. Like it can't be destroyed by light, it can't be destroyed by heat, it can't interact with a non-amino acid. All these things that normally happen in chemical bonding and interaction of atoms and so on and so forth, it couldn't happen. You have to keep that standing, but that's not the way it works. And so it's even more and more impossible and this is just an amino acid. We're not even getting to a cell. We're not even getting to a bacteria. We're just talking about amino acids in protein that then gives you the cell, or is an important function as the cell operates. I mean, amino acids, to the extent needed to form proteins, have never been formed convincingly in experiments that seek to replicate the prebiotic atmosphere to see if amino acids can be formed from non-living matter. Either they have gotten the elements wrong, or have conspicuously left certain things out, like oxygen, because of the disastrous effect that things like oxygen have on their results. So basically they create this soup and put it all together. Oh look, we got an amino acid! Well, you don't have oxygen in the environment. And oxygen is particularly detrimental if you're trying to create amino acids, as oxygen presents dynamics in that combination of things that would destroy the possibility of or make it less probable that amino acid would form. Walter Bradley and Charles Thaxton, in their chapter in the book, The Creation Hypothesis, explain that naturalism has misunderstood different levels of order and the information required for different kinds of order. See, naturalism was born out of the scientific revolution because it was in that era that certain phenomena, like a snowflake, for instance, was explained for the first time. So the conclusion that came from this is that if certain aspects of creation can be explained by natural causes, maybe everything can be. And that is where Bradley and Thaxton say that viewpoint does not recognize the different kind of order that is in nature. For example, there are places one could go to see a rock formation that by erosion, something like a human face appears. I mean, many of us here in New England are familiar with the man in the mountain. If you've ever seen it up in New Hampshire, I think it actually is deteriorating, so you might not be able to see it anymore. But I remember as a kid, it fell down, didn't it? Yeah. But anyways, as a kid, I remember going and seeing, and you know something? That looks awfully like a guy's face, and the beard, and the chin, and all the different things that are there. And basically, you could go there and explain that from natural causes. There's erosion, water came here, and it didn't go there, and eroded this, and it didn't erode that. And that's a certain kind of order that you observe. But this is very different from what we see on Mount Rushmore. By observing that, we can see, and we also know, that those faces were crafted by an intelligent designer that did not rely on natural causes to create the faces of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt. Well, if all we saw in nature was the kind of order like the man in the mountain, then naturalism would suffice. But if at any point we saw order like Mount Rushmore, we would have to see an intelligent designer behind it. See, in randomness, where there is no order, information is neither high or specified. This, like random letters on a page, any child could perform. You know, when you have a child and they're scribbling and, you know, they're putting letters here and they fill a page with just random letters. I mean, that's not, you would not even call that order. That's randomness. And that would never accomplish the specificity and the complexity of what we have in creation. But that is a certain kind of order, right? Certain things are like that in terms of randomness, creating certain dynamics that we observe, even if it was just a child writing on a page. you, I love you, I love you, I love you. See, it's still order. You can still see something happening, that things aren't random all over the place, but it's just repeated over and over again. Now, the second kind of order is both specified and high in information. It is the novel that fills the page with sentences, paragraphs, and coherent thoughts. And as you think of creation, as you think about the things we observe, we really do observe all those kinds of order, and we have to define things according to those terms. See, we can't make the leap just because we see some order in some scenario that seems to come about by natural causes and say, well, that must be the way living things happen. Because once you move from order that is naturalistic, that is about erosion or about just different things that we may observe, naturally in terms of how things just naturally work themselves out, that is completely different than structuring life, supporting life, growing life, healing life, addressing the different things that come about in terms of all that happens in us. I mean, anyone would be amazed by the simplicity of the DNA molecule structure, but the complexity, but then wowed by the complexity in its function. It determines every aspect of genetics and heredity: color of hair, eyes, height, skin tone, bone structure, what diseases you might have a propensity for, metabolic rate, and carries information on how all other aspects of how our bodies will be formed. In other words, it contains code, detailed and high amount of information. I mean, doesn't that by definition call for a designer? Again, that even goes beyond the difference between the Man on the Mountain and Mount Rushmore in terms of just the complexity and detail and refinement that needs to happen. It is really awe-inspiring. And it really leaves little doubt to the fact that there is a designer. See, I think in many ways we have to almost deny that information. We have to really work hard to explain things by natural causes. And there seems to be something behind the arguments and the defenses that come against creationism that is more about the God that is beyond creation that really isn't about the evidence. It's not about the evidence that is there, because the evidence is compelling. The evidence it drives you to the idea that there is a designer, but I think behind it, people just don't want to recognize the God that is behind the creation, who is the designer. Now, Michael Behe gives an excellent challenge to evolution and naturalism from a biochemical point of view in his book, Darwin's Black Box. In the book, he presents what he believes to be the greatest enemy of Darwinian evolution, and to him it is not the fossil record, but the cell. And actually, Mike, can you run down here and grab this? And you're going to see, I meant to give this to you. See a picture of the cell. And just, one of the most basic building blocks of, it's really when you consider all the things that are even behind a cell coming into being, it's a complexity in and of itself in terms of the proteins that are operating there, all the things we've discussed in terms of amino acids and being in the right order, in the right place, and the right bond, and the right kind of amino acid. That amazing probability of it not happening by accident or by chance, and how throwing cards up in the air, it really is nothing compared to that. And so basically here we have the cell. Darwin himself admitted, and I quote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." Let me say that again. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modification, my theory would absolutely break down. The reason for that is, once a complex system simply appeared on the scene intact that did not develop by gradual natural causes, it would require a designer. See, if things move from the simple to the complex, nature, and more appropriately natural selection can't explain that. But something beginning as complex, I'm sorry, something developing, it can explain that, but something beginning as complex would require an explanation behind naturalism. In response to this, Behe presents two concepts: irreducible complexity and minimal function. Irreducible complexity, it says, a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, where the removal of any one of those parts causes the system to effectively cease to function. Now, I know I just said a lot of words, but this mousetrap will explain exactly what I said. Basically, you all know what this is in terms of what purpose it has for. Not good for mice, it is good for us. But really, you just have 5 elements here. You have the backing or the board. You've got the spring that activates the hammer. You've got the hammer. You've got this little thing that holds the hammer in place. And then you've got this thing that holds the lat, the catch, that holds both the restraint and the cheese or the peanut butter or whatever that you put on there to bait the mouse. So basically you have just 5 elements that basically, if you had any of them independent of the other, they would not lead to the function of the mousetrap. If you just had a bunch of bases around and they were floating around in some prebiotic soup, it would do no good for catching mice. It would do no good in building life, because the board in and of itself doesn't accomplish the function. If you had all of these things and you had